Not long ago, I was asked to do a memorial service, and one of the readings that this person's family member selected was Dylan Thomas's favorite or famous poem, "Do not go gentle into that dark night. Do not go gentle into that dark night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." That's how it begins. And it's a powerful poem. It's a poignant poem. It speaks to a sense of existential anguish in the face of our mortality. It is a way of thinking about death as being a hard dividing line that separates the living from the dead, that separates those who remain from those who have gone before. And it's a sentiment that is threaded throughout history. It's a part of different cultures. There's a philosophy attached to it that can be quite profound. There's a sort of memento mori in it, in this memory in this remembering that we too shall die, that we are mortal, that we only get a limited time here on earth. There is a power to thinking about that, contemplating that, and then thinking about what it is that we need to do and savor here in this life, in this brief time that we have. And that was the spirit in which this person wanted me to include that poem in the memorial service for their beloved ancestor who had just departed, because the feeling was for them that that person had savored life fully, and in contemplating that person's life, that family member's life, it would remind us to do the same. Of course, that's a perspective on death. It's one perspective on death. It's not the only perspective on death. However, there are other perspectives on death that think of that line between living and dead, between those who remain and the ancestors who have gone on, as being much softer, as being more permeable, as being something that can be penetrated at different times of the year, where sometimes it is thought that the ancestors cross back over to whisper things to us. And then perhaps if we word it in just the right way, with just the right tone, the ancestors can hear us back. This is a view of death that is different. It's not that there's a sharp dividing line. It's a bit more like this person who has left has slipped into another room. And there is a beautiful poem, and this was one that I was asked to recite at another memorial service recently. And the poem basically says, "Death is nothing at all. Call me by the old familiar name. I have just slipped into the room next to yours. Treat me no differently." And there is a power in that perspective as well. Something really deep, profound, tender, heartfelt, loving in thinking that our ancestors are still there, that they can hear our voices, and that sometimes if we listen closely enough, perhaps if we listen more often to things than to beings, we will hear the ancestors' breath in the voice of the fire. We will hear the ancestors' breath and their voice in all of the surrounding experiences that we have. One of the things I love about Unitarian Universalism is that it is a pluralistic faith. And we welcome people to bring their heritage with them. And so we have members who, have a Jewish heritage and celebrate Shabbat and Yom Kippur and Hanukkah. We have members who are Christian and will celebrate Christmas Eve and Easter. We have members who have a loving kindness practice that emerges from Buddhism. And sometimes these are practices that we've come to later in life and that have come to mean quite a bit to us. And sometimes they are ancestral practices that we were born with and raised with. One of the things that I have really admired about our new president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, is that she talks about an ancestral practice that has come with her. She talks about practicing not only Unitarian Universalism, but also carrying practices of her ancestors, part of practices that are defined in academic terms as African traditional religions, or ATRs. And there's a great diversity of those, and I can't make a whole lot of generalization about them. And I'm not even going to speak too much to Sophia's experience, that she can articulate her own experience around that. But one of the things that I deeply appreciate about many ATRs, African traditional religions, is that they view that boundary that separates the living from the dead, that separates those who are still here, those who remain from the ancestors, as a soft boundary. They view it as a permeable boundary. And they have many practices in which they call forth to the ancestors to be present with them, to provide support through the continuing struggles that people experience here and now. They call forth to the ancestors and they listen for the ancestors, listen for the wisdom that might be whispered to them in dreams and in voices. If you just attune your ear to listen in just the right way, hearing those whispers of wisdom that can come forth. Now, those of us who are gathered here today, this Sunday morning, we're going to have lots of different perspectives on the afterlife. Even though we come from Universalists who had a pretty thoughtful view, like they had a pretty established view of what was going to happen after you died. They thought everybody was going to go to heaven, and they knew there was a heaven, and that's where everybody was going to go. Today, Unitarian Universalists have a range of ideas about what might happen in an afterlife. I think it's probably pretty safe to say that, like, one of the things we can agree on is that whatever it is, it's not hell. But other than not hell, it may be a whole lot of things. Some of us might have a pretty scientific understanding of what happens after you die. And some of us might have a very mystical sense of what happens after death, a mystical sense grounded in a personal religious experience, perhaps of the ancestors that whisper to us and that hear us when we whisper back. I think that no matter what our beliefs are about the afterlife, there are two important things that we might be able to take from this notion that there might be some kind of soft line that divides us from the ancestors. So hear me out on this. The first one is that there is a certain comfort that comes from feeling that this person who has been separated from you, this person who might have been wrenched from your life, this person that you may have a deep personal grief and pain at their loss, this hole that cannot be filled by anything else that is present and living today. There can be a sense of comfort in feeling that yes, I do sometimes hear that person's voice. I do sometimes feel that person's presence. When I lost my first husband in an accident back when I was 24, I had dreams where he showed up to me and spoke to me. And people might say, well, that's just your grief speaking, right? Maybe, maybe not. Does it matter? Does it matter? If it provides you with some comfort and fortitude to survive the hardest edges of grief, does it matter? Are we going to have an argument about what is and is not in a moment like that? I hope not. I hope not. The other thing that I think is very powerful about some of these practices, and this will be the last thing I mention, is that some of the practices that come from the ATRs, the African traditional religions, they don't only talk about the ancestors that you had a great relationship with. Sometimes they talk about the ancestors that you had a complicated relationship with, perhaps an estranged relationship with. Perhaps that person died and you were on bad terms. And there are some practices that, I've been speaking with some practitioners and learning more about African traditional religions that I think are quite powerful. One of them is that you might have this ancestor that you were estranged with in life, and you're not ready to put that person on your ancestor altar. And so instead, you might have their picture in a box. And then eventually you might be able to take the picture out of the box, but it's on the other side of the room. And then it starts to move closer and closer to the altar. And at the same time that you're doing this, you're praying and chanting and singing in hope of some kind of reconciliation that can happen for this spirit who is on the other side, who died estranged from the family. Eventually, they are brought on to the family altar, and there is a reconciliation that occurs. Now, is that actually happening on the other side? Whatever the other side is? Who knows? Maybe, possibly. But is there some benefit in engaging in a practice like that for your heart? When you have been estranged from this person, when the very thought of that person just gives you this feeling of, ugh, maybe there is still some benefit in that because it is healing a part of your heart that was unresolved, unfinished, a part of your relationship with that person that was wounded and that did not find closure. There is a lot of wisdom in these traditions, in these practices that whisper across the line between the living and the dead, that view that line as a softer one. And I think the invitation for us is to think about which ancestors we want whispering to us, which ones we would like to whisper back to, which ones we would like to heal a relationship with, and hope that wherever they are finding, at the very least, peace, but possibly reconciliation and healing as well. I think that's good for our hearts. I think it's good for our world. Amen.